When German soldiers were captured in 1943 and 1944 from the sands of North Africa, the mountains of Italy, and eventually the hedgerows of Normandy, they carried with them a single grim expectation. Captivity would be harsh, food would be scarce, and survival would be uncertain. Years of Nazi propaganda had hammered a single message into their minds. Americans were decadent, ruthless, and would treat prisoners no better than criminals. Many Wehrmacht troops, particularly captured with the Afrika Korps or in the Falaise Pocket, believed their fate would resemble what they had seen on the Eastern Front, where German and Soviet POWs alike endured starvation, exposure, and death on a massive scale. With that fear heavy on their shoulders, they boarded Liberty ships under guard, bound for a strange land they had only glimpsed on propaganda posters and stolen radio broadcasts, the United States. None of them imagined that their first shock upon entering an American POW camp would not be cruelty, but abundance. The journey itself reinforced their dread. Soldiers packed into ships expected to be sent to labor camps, mining operations, or detention facilities in remote deserts. Instead, they were transported deep into the American heartland, Alabama, Iowa, Tennessee, passing endless fields of corn, neat white houses, and small towns that looked untouched by war. Many POWs later admitted that even the journey made them uneasy. The sheer prosperity of the American countryside, visible from train windows, clashed violently with German propaganda that insisted the United States was collapsing under poverty and political chaos. When the gates of Camp Opelika in Alabama or Camp Algona in Iowa finally opened before them, German prisoners braced for brutality. But instead of barked commands and punishment squads, they were greeted by orderly processing lines, uniformed guards offering instructions in calm voices, and a medical inspection administered by U.S. Army doctors. Then came the moment that stunned nearly every new arrival, the first meal. According to War Department TM 19500 and Geneva Convention guidelines, the United States was legally required to feed POWs at the same standard as its own troops. And unlike most belligerents in the war, America actually did so. The first trays set in front of the POWs contained items many had not tasted in years: white bread, real butter, potatoes, meat, sometimes beef or pork, along with canned fruit or vegetables. Coffee appeared at nearly every meal. For men who had come straight from the deteriorating rations of the Wehrmacht, where portions shrank drastically after the defeats at Stalingrad and in Normandy, this quantity and quality of food seemed unbelievable. And this was only the beginning. German prisoners soon discovered that American camps were not starved, crumbling compounds, but highly organized facilities with barracks, infirmaries, movie halls, sports fields, and even educational programs. But the food was the element that hit them hardest. For soldiers who had lived for months on thin soup, ersatz coffee, and rough gray bread made from sawdust-filled flour, the sight of baskets of fresh, white bread set openly in the dining halls seemed impossible. It was not rationed. It sat in the center of the table, ready to be taken without limit. Some POWs initially refused to touch it, assuming it was a trick. Others hid extra slices in their clothing, expecting the abundance to vanish. But the guards simply shrugged. There would be more tomorrow, and the day after, and every day thereafter. This contrast was particularly shocking given the state of the German home front in 1944. Families back in Cologne, Hamburg, and Essen survived on ration cards that could barely stretch to a week's worth of simple meals. Butter and sugar were luxuries. Meat was scarce. Chocolate and soft drinks were almost mythical. Yet in America, prisoners of war, men who had fought against the United States, were eating better than many American civilians, let alone their own countrymen. Many POWs later confessed in diaries and oral histories collected by the Office of the Provost Marshal General, OPMG, that they felt ashamed. They had believed deeply in the Reich's portrayal of itself as the strongest and most advanced nation in the world, but here, behind barbed wire on another continent,
they were confronted with a different truth. The United States had so much food that it could afford to give hearty meals to its enemies. This realization was followed by another, even more surprising. The Americans were not feeding them generously out of kindness alone. They were following the Geneva Convention of 1929, which mandated humane treatment, medical care, and rations equal in quantity and quality to those of depot troops. For the U.S., a nation with vast agricultural surpluses and logistical systems unmatched in the world, this meant POWs would receive 3,000 to 3,500 calories a day, including bread, butter, meat, potatoes, and coffee. And as many POWs soon learned, that was only the beginning of their cultural astonishment. Because in camps like Opelika, Algona, and Crossville, the Americans were about to introduce them to something they had never dreamed would appear inside a prison compound: Coca-Cola and ice cream. The first time a group of newly arrived German POWs at Camp Algona saw crates of Coca-Cola being unloaded beside the mess hall, several of them genuinely thought it was a warehouse delivery mistake, supplies intended for American troops, not prisoners. They watched the bottles clink together in the sunlight, the familiar curved glass shape catching their eyes. In wartime Germany, Coca-Cola had all but disappeared by 1942 after the U.S. embargo cut off key ingredients. To most of these men, it had become a symbol of an unattainable luxury, something they associated with pre-war city cafes or the rare black market stash. The idea that they, as prisoners, might be allowed to drink it bordered on absurd. Then they were told to line up for dinner, and the shock only grew deeper. Instead of thin slices of dark rye bread scraped together from ration remnants, what they had eaten in Wehrmacht units during the final years of the war, they were handed thick slices of fluffy white bread, the kind many had not tasted since childhood. White bread in the Third Reich had been largely reserved for hospital patients or the wealthy. Wartime regulations had banned it almost entirely for ordinary civilians. Here in America, it was stacked in overflowing baskets, with signs that simply read, "Take what you need." Some POWs later admitted they took extra and hid it in their jackets, convinced that such abundance must be temporary. But the guards, seeing their nervous hoarding, laughed softly and said, "There will be more tomorrow." And there always was. Meat followed. Actual meat, not the tiny portions of horse, rabbit, or ersatz sausage that German soldiers had grown accustomed to since 1943. At Camp Crossville, lunch often included beef stew or pork chops with potatoes. At Algona, they received chicken on Sundays. At Opelika, canned fruit appeared at least 3 times a week. Then came the most surreal item on the table, a small aluminum dish served after dinner, cold to the touch, filled with ice cream. No German POW could believe it. Ice cream had vanished from German cities years earlier. Dairy shortages, sugar rationing, and bombing destruction of refrigeration plants meant that even German children rarely saw it. And yet here it was, in a prison camp, for the very soldiers who had fought the Americans delivering it. Some POWs refused to eat it at first, thinking it a mistake or a joke. Others ate slowly, suspiciously, expecting scolding from guards. But the guards said nothing. They simply moved on, handing out spoons. The ice cream served in American POW camps wasn't a rare treat. It was part of the routine, especially in 1944-45, when U.S. supply lines were at full wartime strength. In Camp Algona, prisoners later recalled receiving ice cream so consistently that they began to associate Saturday evenings with ice essen, their new ritual of sitting under warm Iowa sunsets with bowls of something they had thought belonged only to peace and prosperity. And then there was the Coca-Cola. Not a ration, not a reward, just another beverage option, distributed during social events, holiday meals, or on days when supply convoys arrived with extra cases. Many POWs admitted that Coke shocked them even more than the ice cream. It was the perfect symbol of American industrial power. Sweet, cold, fizzy, unnecessary, and seemingly limitless. One former Africa Corps prisoner wrote in a post-war memoir, "The sight of Coca-Cola in a prison camp told us more about America than any propaganda leaflet the Allies ever dropped." Just as striking was the sheer quantity of food.
American policy, under both the Provost Marshal General and the Geneva Convention, required POWs to receive 3,000 to 3,500 calories per day, similar to the ration of active U.S. depot troops. And because American agriculture was overflowing with production during the war, camps easily exceeded those numbers. POWs soon learned the phrase that circulated among guards: better to overfeed than to have trouble. Full prisoners were cooperative prisoners. Hungry ones could become dangerous. For German soldiers who had watched their own rations shrink at the front, where bread contained filler sawdust, coffee was brewed from roasted barley, and meat was a distant memory, the American dining hall became a place of disbelief. Men whispered to each other in line, "Can this be real? Are we allowed to eat this much? How does the enemy feed us better than the fatherland?" Some even refused their first meals out of pride or suspicion, but hunger always won, and within days they ate alongside everyone else, stunned but grateful. The shock reached beyond food. The mess halls themselves were clean, bright, and efficient. Prisoners sat at real tables, not on cold concrete floors. They used metal trays and proper utensils. They drank water from clean taps, not the contaminated wells or improvised canteens of the front. They ate under electric lights, surrounded by order and structure, not in dugouts or burned-out barns. According to multiple oral histories from Camp Opelika, the moment many POWs realized America was fundamentally different than they had been taught was the moment they saw trash bins overflowing with leftover bread. To waste bread was unthinkable in wartime Germany. Here, it was routine. One prisoner wrote later, "I stood there staring at the bins and thought, this nation is so rich it throws away what we fight to obtain." That was the beginning of a deeper shock, one that would challenge everything they thought they knew. Because the food they were being given was not an accident. It was a reflection of a society whose prosperity, values, and discipline were unlike anything they had imagined. And soon they would learn that this abundance was only the first step in redefining their understanding of America.
As German POWs settled into life inside camps like Opelika, Algona, and Crossville, the overwhelming abundance of food continued to puzzle them. Day after day, the same patterns repeated. Baskets of white bread delivered without rationing, trays filled with meat and potatoes, side dishes of vegetables and fruit, even the occasional dessert. The question lingered in the minds of many prisoners: why would America, at war with Germany, feed its enemies so well? The answer lay in a blend of legal obligation, strategic calculation, and the sheer industrial strength of the United States during World War II. Factors that German soldiers, raised on Nazi propaganda and accustomed to scarcity, had never imagined. The first and most straightforward reason was written into international law. Unlike the Third Reich, which routinely bent or ignored conventions when they became inconvenient, the United States adhered strictly to the Geneva Convention of 1929, which required that POWs be provided the same rations as depot troops. For America, this meant POWs received nearly identical meals to those served at stateside bases: meat, bread, coffee, vegetables, and adequate calories to maintain health. The U.S. Army took this obligation seriously, not only for moral reasons, but for practical ones. If American POWs fell into German hands, and tens of thousands did over the course of the war, their treatment could be influenced by how German prisoners were treated in America. Every loaf of white bread a German prisoner received was, in the eyes of the U.S. War Department, a form of insurance for American soldiers captured overseas. But legality alone did not explain the staggering variety and volume of food. There was a deeper, more strategic layer. A fed prisoner is a manageable prisoner. American commanders understood that full stomachs made inmates more cooperative, easier to supervise, and less likely to plot escapes or engage in sabotage. When the OPMG, Office of the Provost Marshal General, reviewed POW camp disturbances across the country, they found a direct correlation. Camps that offered reliable food supplies experienced fewer incidents. In essence, American policy turned abundance into security. Keeping POWs fed wasn't kindness, it was control. Then there was the question of capability. Even if America wanted to comply with the Geneva Convention, could it actually afford to feed 370,000 German POWs at high standards? The answer, surprising to many Germans, was yes, because the United States of the 1940s was a global agricultural powerhouse. American farms, untouched by bombing and supercharged by wartime demand, produced record quantities of wheat, corn, beef, dairy, sugar, and eggs. The U.S. home front had rationing, but it was light by European standards and often more symbolic than restrictive. Where Germany struggled with shortages due to Allied bombing, U-boat blockades, and mismanaged wartime agriculture, the United States was drowning in surplus. To German prisoners, the idea that a nation could be both at war and overflowing with food felt contradictory, almost impossible. Their own homeland had endured rationing since 1939 and near starvation conditions from 1943 onward. Bombed railways and ports meant what little food existed could not reach cities efficiently. By 1944, German civilians were eating ersatz bread mixed with sawdust, coffee brewed from roasted barley, and sausages that contained less than 10% meat. Against that backdrop, POW camps in America felt like a different universe. Another key factor was psychological warfare. Though subtle, it was undeniably present. American officials understood that treating POWs humanely undermined the ideological foundation of Nazism. Kindness, abundance, and predictability were powerful tools against soldiers indoctrinated to believe the United States was barbaric and chaotic. Every spoonful of ice cream served in a mess hall was, in its own quiet way, a counter-propaganda strike. Many POWs would later admit that the first seeds of doubt about Hitler's promises were planted in camp dining halls, not through lectures, but through meals that contradicted everything the Reich had taught them. And then there was the cultural dimension. Americans in the 1940s believed deeply in what they called fair play. It was not a political stance, but a national identity. To mistreat prisoners was, in the view of both the public and the military, un-American. American newspapers occasionally reported on POW camp conditions, and the War Department knew that starving prisoners would cause outrage among citizens who prided themselves on moral leadership. American Army manuals emphasized treating POWs with dignity, not only to uphold national values, but to maintain discipline among guards. Abuse was seen as a breakdown of order, a sign of weak leadership, and a violation of the principles soldiers were sworn to uphold. These layers, law, strategy, abundance, psychology, and identity, combined to create a system where German POWs received meals that rivaled or exceeded what many American families ate during the war. This was not generosity. It was the expression of a nation powerful enough, confident enough, and organized enough to behave humanely, even while fighting for its survival. Yet for the German prisoners themselves, these explanations were distant and abstract. What they experienced was simpler and more visceral. They were eating well, unbelievably well. They gained weight, their health improved, their energy returned. Many looked younger after a few months in captivity than when they had arrived. And every time they lifted a Coca-Cola bottle, or bit into soft white bread, or tasted ice cream melting on their tongues, they felt a mix of relief, confusion, and something harder to describe, an uncomfortable awareness that their enemy was far richer, far more capable, and far more disciplined than they had been taught to believe. For many POWs, that was the turning point, the moment when shock began to evolve into introspection. Because if America treated its prisoners this well, what else about the world had the Nazi regime lied about? The question would follow them for the rest of their captivity and far beyond.
The shock did not fade with time. Instead, it deepened as German POWs settled into the routines of life inside camps like Opelika, Algona, and Crossville. Each passing week revealed another layer of abundance, another reminder that the United States, enemy of the Reich, was feeding them with a generosity unmatched even in their own homeland. For soldiers conditioned by years of scarcity and propaganda, the experience was nothing short of disorienting. Many POWs later wrote that the moment the true magnitude of this abundance struck them came not from the first meal or the first Coca-Cola, but from a far more mundane sight: trash barrels overflowing with untouched bread. For German soldiers who had grown up in a nation that revered bread as almost sacred, the sight bordered on sacrilege. In Germany, bread was rationed tightly and thrown away only in the direst of circumstances. In wartime Berlin, Hamburg, or Frankfurt, families collected crumbs in jars and stretched loaves for days. Yet here in America, inside a prison camp, bread was discarded casually, scraped off trays into bins because there would always be more tomorrow. At that moment, wrote a former prisoner from Opelika, I understood that everything the Reich told us about America was a lie. The shock intensified with each passing meal. POWs found themselves served dish after dish that had become mythical luxuries back home: real butter, fresh eggs, cream, fruit preserves, beef, and occasionally roast chicken. The contrast was not merely nutritional, it was emotional. Many men felt a sense of shame, even guilt, knowing their families were scraping through the ruins of German cities, while they themselves were eating full, warm meals 3 times a day. Some POWs wrote heartbreaking letters home in which they avoided describing camp meals out of fear of hurting the loved ones who had far less than they did. One POW in Crossville admitted, I felt embarrassed to enjoy the food. My mother would have cried to see how much we threw away. But the most powerful cultural shock came from the American attitude towards feeding prisoners. Guards did not mock POWs for their hunger or make jokes about the generous portions. They treated mealtime like a routine administrative task, something that simply had to be done correctly. There was no humiliation, no power play, no attempt to use food as leverage. German POWs, accustomed to a military culture where deprivation was normalized and suffering was often viewed as proof of loyalty, found this baffling. Then came the holidays. At Camp Algona, turkey dinners included turkey, stuffing, vegetables, pie, and sometimes ice cream. The prisoners decorated their barracks, organized choirs, and were even allowed to build a life-size nativity scene, an act unthinkable in many other warring nations. When guards brought out cases of Coca-Cola and placed them next to the mess hall, POWs assumed they were meant for American personnel. When told they were the ones who would be drinking them, a stunned silence took over the room. No one back home has Coca-Cola, whispered a former Africa Corps corporal. Not even officers. In Camp Crossville, a group of POWs were assigned to work in the camp's bakery. What they witnessed there reshaped their understanding of American life more than any lecture ever could. The facility produced hundreds of loaves per day, using soft white flour that German bakers had not seen since the 1930s. The ovens were modern, the ingredients plentiful, and the atmosphere calm. One POW baker recalled that the first time he opened a 50-pound sack of pure white flour, he nearly cried. It had become a rarity in Germany long before Stalingrad. POWs working in agricultural details experienced another revelation. They saw American farms producing staggering amounts of wheat, corn, dairy, and livestock. Even small farms had machinery that German farmers could only dream of owning. They saw tractors larger than the trucks used by the Wehrmacht. They saw silos overflowing with grain, fields stretching farther than the eye could see, and refrigerators stocked with butter, milk, and cheese. Only then, one POW said, did we begin to understand why our own cities were starving. The cultural shock went beyond food. It extended to the behavior of guards, the discipline of the camp system, and the casual wealth of American daily life. When POWs received soap, toilet paper, toothpaste, and razors, items scarce or non-existent in Germany, they began to compare the two societies not in terms of ideology, but in terms of who could provide a stable, functioning life for ordinary people. It is no exaggeration to say that many German POWs underwent a profound internal shift during their captivity. Some had entered the camps as ardent Nazis, convinced of German superiority and American decadence. Months later, they found themselves reevaluating everything they believed. A former SS officer held at Crossville later admitted in testimony, "It was not American propaganda that defeated my beliefs. It was American food." And then was the ultimate symbol of American prosperity:
ice cream. The fact that prisoners received ice cream regularly, not as a rare treat, became a running joke among POWs. Many wrote in diaries that no German soldier at the front saw ice cream even once during the war. When prisoners discovered that American school children also ate ice cream weekly, the realization hit hard. Even the children of the enemy were better fed than the soldiers of the Reich. The cultural dissonance reached its peak when POWs compared their conditions with letters received from home. Families described bombed cities, ration shortages, cold winters, and long lines for food. Meanwhile, the POWs were gaining weight, playing soccer, and drinking Coke. The guilt, confusion, and astonishment formed a volatile mix that shaped their views for the rest of their lives. Many POWs later acknowledged that it was during these months, and sometimes these meals, that they began to lose faith in the regime they once served. Inside the barbed wire, while eating food better than anything the Reich could offer, they saw with painful clarity that the world they had fought for was collapsing, and the world they had fought against was thriving. And nothing made that more obvious than a slice of white bread and a bottle of Coca-Cola.
By the time the war ended in Europe in May 1945, the hundreds of thousands of German POWs held in the United States were no longer the same men who had first stepped off the trains at Opelika, Algona, Crossville, or the dozens of other camps scattered across the American heartland. Months of steady meals, humane treatment, and a daily routine built not on ideology but on order and decency had reshaped the way they saw not just America but themselves, their homeland, and the government they had once pledged loyalty to. As repatriation began in late 1945 and continued through 1946, these men prepared to return to a Germany devastated by bombing, divided by occupation zones, and suffering from severe food shortages. Many POWs wrote in their journals or admitted later in interviews that they felt anxious, not about going home, but about leaving a place where they had been fed, clothed, treated, and managed with an unexpected professionalism that had contradicted everything the Nazi regime had promised them about the decadent, cruel American enemy. The final weeks in camp revealed just how deeply American routines had become ingrained in their lives. POWs received their last meals, white bread, butter, meat, potatoes, and sometimes ice cream, and many found themselves lingering, realizing that these foods, so normal in captivity, might be rare luxuries back in Germany. Some men wrote that they dreaded the return to ration cards and empty shelves. Others described guilt at having lived well while their families suffered through bombings, evacuations, and the hunger winter of 1944-45. Yet beneath that guilt was another layer, something more complicated and far more profound. They had seen another system up close, and it had changed them. For many POWs, the United States had become the first democratic society they ever experienced in more than a superficial way. Not through propaganda, not through lectures, but through the everyday functioning of a camp. Scheduled work, medical care, education programs, sports leagues, libraries, church services, fair discipline, predictable food distribution, and a complete absence of the cruelty they expected. Many German prisoners had grown up in the rigid authoritarianism of the 1930s. They had been told that strength required brutality and that mercy was weakness. Yet here was a nation that was winning the war by being organized, not violent, lawful, not arbitrary, generous, not fearful. In dozens of interviews collected by the U.S. Army and later by German historians during the 1950s and 60s, POWs repeatedly said the same thing. They admired the fairness of American guards. These men enforced rules, but without humiliation. They maintained discipline, but without hatred. They were strict, but not cruel. One POW stated bluntly, "The Americans treated us better as prisoners than the Nazis treated us as soldiers."
Another recalled how guards corrected behavior without shouting, simply pointing to posted rules, rules that never changed from one day to the next. Their order was not our order. It was a quiet order, a POW wrote. This steady environment, combined with abundant meals, created fertile ground for self-reflection. Over time, many POWs began to question the ideology they had carried into the war. A former NCO from the Africa Corps later wrote that he felt the Third Reich collapsing inside me every time he saw American workers deliver fresh food to the camp. Another POW described his first major doubt about Hitler's promises as occurring the moment he saw guards distribute Coca-Cola to prisoners on Christmas Eve. How could a nation that wastes sugar on prisoners be losing the war? Some POWs were even offered the chance to attend re-education programs, especially in 1945 when the U.S. sought to encourage democratic thinking among German soldiers before repatriation. But many POWs didn't need formal instruction. Their education came from daily life, seeing guards eat the same food as they did, watching American officers treat workers respectfully, or witnessing a system where rules, not ideology, governed behavior. By the time they boarded ships home, countless POWs had already rejected the propagandistic worldview they had once embraced. When they returned to Germany, they found a nation in ruins. Cities were flattened, homes were destroyed, food was rationed as strictly as ever. For many, the shock of returning home rivaled the shock of entering the American camps. A former prisoner from Algona described returning to Cologne as walking into a shadow, adding, "I had lived like a human being in America. Now I was back to hunger." Yet these experiences planted seeds. A significant number of former POWs later became central in rebuilding West Germany after 1949. They became bakers, teachers, mechanics, farmers, businessmen, public servants. Many credited their time in American camps with teaching them practical skills, carpentry, agriculture, English, but more than that, with teaching them new ways of thinking. Some historians later describe these men as quiet ambassadors, returning home with an understanding of democracy, compromise, and civilian responsibility that helped stabilize a society rebuilding from moral and physical ruins. Even in their personal lives, the legacy endured. Some POWs named their children after American guards or officers. Others subscribed to American magazines or wrote letters to former camp workers. A few immigrated to the United States years later, seeking the stability and prosperity they had glimpsed through the barbed wire. But the most universal memory, the detail that showed up again and again in memoirs, oral histories, and late-life interviews, was the food. POWs spoke of white bread with something close to reverence. They remembered ice cream with the clarity of childhood memory. They recalled Coca-Cola as a symbol of a world that had never known the shortages, fear, or ideological rigidity of the Reich. These foods were not luxuries. They were emblems of a different way of living, a society strong enough not to starve its enemies. German POWs returned home not as broken men, but as witnesses to a truth their government had tried to hide, that America, for all its flaws, operated from strength, confidence, and a belief that decency was not a weakness, but a foundation. And long after the battles ended, long after the camps closed, long after many of these men had lived full lives, one memory still stood above all others: the day they learned that even in captivity, the enemy fed them better than the country they fought for.